Thanks everybody for joining us. My name is Tom Popinski, and I'd like to welcome everybody for the latest installation of our Indonesia Social Science Seminar Series, or IS4 as we like to call it. Sponsored by the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the Cornell Southeast Asia Program, and KITLV in the Netherlands, this series brings together social science experts from across the globe to discuss pressing issues facing Indonesia and to foster new opportunities for networking. I'm Tom Popinski from the Southeast Asia Program at Cornell, and I'll be your chair and moderator for today. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Rachel Rinaldo, who will be speaking with us today on her fascinating new research project, I Have a Right to a Better Imam, Women, Divorce, and Islam in Indonesia. Rachel is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Colorado at Boulder, go Buffs, and the Faculty Director of the Center for Asian Studies. Her research interests include gender and sexuality, development and social change, religion and qualitative methods with a focus on Indonesia. And her wonderful first book is entitled Mobilizing Piety, Islam and Feminism in Indonesia, which was an ethnographic study of women's activist negotiations of Islam and feminism. Rachel, I'll turn this over now to you, and I look forward to learning from you for the next little bit here. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And thanks so much to the IS4 team for inviting me to share my research with you all. And good morning to all of those of you who are tuning in from the US, and selamat malam kepada teman-teman yang ada di Indonesia. I'm here in Yogyakarta. And good evening to those of you in Australia, where I think it's quite late at night. So yes, my talk today focuses on Muslim women's divorce experiences, particularly in the context of the Islamic legal system in Indonesia. And so, as you probably know, Islamic law, quite different from other religious traditions, regulates marriage, divorce, and inheritance for Muslims. And so it's a major influence on women's status and rights, because it really kind of lays out the responsibilities and obligations and rights that women have within these spheres of life. Now, of course, Islamic law is interpreted in many different ways around the world, but there are some commonalities between different schools of Islamic law. And generally speaking, family law in Muslim traditions stipulates a particular gendered model of marriage, with a husband who is a breadwinner and the person who financially supports the family, a wife who is responsible for the domestic sphere. And very often written into marriage contracts is the idea that in return for the husband's support of the household, the wife obeys him. Now, when it comes to divorce, in most Muslim schools of Muslim jurisprudence, divorce is fairly easy for women. It's not, or for men, sorry. It's not the taboo that it is, for instance, in many Christian traditions. On the other hand, women tend to have limited rights to divorce. And often sort of very narrow grounds for being able to sue for divorce. They also are often very financially disadvantaged, even if they're able to sue for a divorce. So, for example, in some schools of Muslim law, it can be difficult for women to gain custody of their children if they're the ones who sue for divorce. They're also often not entitled to very much financial restitution. So that means that historically, in many majority Muslim societies, there have been a lot of obstacles to divorce for women, and certainly some significant disincentives. Yet we've also seen, particularly in the last couple decades, major changes in gender relations and marriage in Muslim societies, including Indonesia. A shift to chosen marriages rather than arranged marriages, particularly among the middle class, increasing educational attainment of women, which generally leads to a later age at marriage and smaller numbers of children, more opportunities for women in the formal workforce, and then also feminist activism that has, in some cases, brought reforms or called for reforms to family law. So the question that really motivated this research was, how are Muslim Indonesian women negotiating divorce in a context where Muslim family law has been institutionalized relatively recently? And what can their experiences tell us about ongoing changes in marriage and gender relations, particularly women's ability to negotiate within Islamic institutions? Now, I'm sure I don't have to convince anyone on this Zoom webinar, but Indonesia is actually an especially interesting place to study these issues. As you might know, traditionally, Indonesia had a very high divorce rate, one of the highest in the world in the first half of the 20th century. And this was mainly because people married very young, marriages were often arranged, and the society generally preferred divorce to the risk of childbirth out of wedlock or marrying later. But this all changed in the second half of the 20th century. And divorce rates dropped sharply, particularly as women entered the educational system, arranged marriages became less common. And so there was a real decline in divorce in the late 20th century, which, as many demographers have noticed, this is very much opposite of the Western pattern. And so by the end of the 20th century, in fact, there was stigma around divorce for women, particularly in more middle-class milieus. But divorce rates began rising again in Indonesia around the year 2000. And have continued to do so. They're still significantly lower than a place like the United States, for example, but it is becoming a fairly common experience. One study recently found that nearly 20% of women in Java between the ages of 15 and 49 have experienced divorce. So, 1 in 5 women of kind of childbearing age. So that means it's something that a lot of women are experiencing, and certainly if they haven't personally experienced, they know somebody who has. As in many other parts of the world, the majority of divorces are also women initiated. And this, of course, intersects with other very important changes related to women. Rising educational attainment, as we've seen in other parts of the world, a shift from women working mainly in the informal economy and agriculture to being more likely to work in the formal economy, particularly in services and education. So just to show you a couple charts here. So this is just the last decade or so, the number of Muslim divorces. And as you can see, it's a pretty continuous rise in divorces, except for the pandemic year of 2020. And then this is looks at the women-initiated divorces versus men-initiated divorces. When women sue for divorce, it's called cerai gugat. When men are suing for divorce, or their unilateral right to divorce, is called cerai talak. So as you can see, it continues to be the case that the vast majority of divorces in Indonesia are cerai gugat, women suing for divorce. Now, Indonesia, another reason that Indonesia is an interesting place to study this is because its institutionalization of Muslim family law is historically relatively recent, in the sense that it was only in 1989 that the religious court system was given formal jurisdiction over Muslim marriages and divorces. And in 1991, there emerged a state-approved version of Muslim family law called the Kompilasi Hukum Islam, or KHI, as I'll call it. And this text is the key reference for the religious courts. And most of what the religious courts do in Indonesia is decide on divorce cases. That's the vast majority of their business. And so KHI is an adaptation of classical Islamic law, but incorporating some aspects of more traditional Indonesian practices. So there are some differences, which I'll talk about in just a moment, between the KHI and other sort of versions of Islamic family law. So in the KHI, there's, a very clear, what I call a primary view of marriage, very similar to other schools of Islamic law, where the husband and wife roles are envisioned as different, complementary with the breadwinner homemaker model, but not equal in the sense that she is supposed to be obedient to him and he is supposed to be the leader of the household. However, there's also quite a bit of language within this text that provides what I would call a secondary view of marriage that has a bit of a different nuance to it. It emphasizes the emotional and spiritual bond between the partners, emphasizing love and companionship between them. So that is sort of not necessarily the primary understanding of marriage, but it's definitely in there. Now, what's different from other family law traditions in Muslim societies is that women in Indonesia with the KHI have a lot more rights to divorce. In fact, I think Indonesia's Muslim family law is probably one of the more liberal in the world, in that women have quite expansive grounds for divorce, including things like infidelity, abuse of alcohol or drugs, conflict, cruelty, lack of financial responsibility, and much more. And the marriage can be dissolved on the basis of conflict and disharmony, which is not the case in some other Muslim family law traditions. However, women are still financially disadvantaged if they're the ones who sue for divorce. They're only entitled to some relatively minor forms of financial restitution, and they're not entitled to financial support for children. So it's certainly a disincentive to divorce for many women. So what I will talk about today is based on research that I did in the years before the pandemic. It was part of a larger collaborative study conducted with Eva Nisa and Nina Nurmila, who may or may not be on this call. And the data that I'll be talking about today draws on my in-depth interviews with divorced women, 34 divorced women. I also interviewed men and judges and did some court observations, but won't be talking as much about that data. But if anyone has questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A. All right, so what I want to do now is talk about the 3 key themes that emerged from the interviews and that I think shed some really interesting light on women's experiences of divorce in the context of Muslim family law. And so this first theme is about the kinds of behavior that women saw as being justification for divorce. And these I called the deal breakers. What's striking about this is that I think you would probably find the same deal breakers pretty much anywhere in the world. There were, certain behaviors that women seemed to find particularly unacceptable: infidelity, conflict, and violence or abuse. But I think through their discussions of these, it became evident that they had certain assumptions about what a marriage should not be like and what it should be like. So we can see in some of these narratives then this sense of like, these were the things that were happening in the marriage that were wrong, and this is not what a marriage should be like. And on the other hand, then they sometimes emphasize what are the things that they felt that they were missing in the marriage, particularly love, communication, and a sense of mutuality or doing things together. And so in this sense, their narratives actually very often echoed that secondary companionate vision of marriage that can be found in the KHI. So for example, when I interviewed Tia, she was a teacher, a university graduate with 1 child, and her marriage broke up after her husband lost his job and then felt threatened by the fact that she had become the breadwinner of the family. For her part, she was frustrated by what she considered to be his total lack of participation in childcare, despite the fact that he wasn't working. And so it all came to a head, she said, When one night I asked him to give our child a bath because I was coming home late, but he wouldn't do it. It had to be me. My husband just hung out with his friends, she said. He didn't even care that I came home. I was tired of it. It had to be both of us. So in this sense, she was really, she was looking for a different kind of marriage, right? Where he was participating, maybe not necessarily equally in the childcare, but was involved in it. And that's what she was lacking. So another theme was that women were very aware, for the most part, that things like infidelity and lack of financial support and even impious behavior were grounds for divorce in the KHI. And they tended, in fact, to frame their narratives, particularly around the lack of financial support. They were often quite aware that judges were especially concerned about this issue, and that judges were generally inclined to give permission for a divorce if the husband didn't fulfill this responsibility. So this was often sort of the very first thing they mentioned, and they, I think, really framed their narratives in terms of financial responsibility because they were so aware that this was kind of a key issue for the judge. So in this sense, the law gives women a way to hold husbands accountable. A way to exit the marriage if the husband can be deemed irresponsible. So Noor, another university graduate, was only married for a couple years in her mid-20s when I talked to her, and they didn't have any children while they were married. She was running an online business, and her husband, when they were first married, demanded that she stopped working, but then didn't give her any money. Then later, when they started experiencing some financial difficulties and she needed to restart her business, she said that he took all of the money from it. So in the interview, she deemed her husband to be not just financially irresponsible, but also abusive and unfaithful. And she said that he just didn't allow her to pursue her dreams. But the judges and religious leaders seemed to be, they were responsive to all of this in her telling, but they were especially responsive to the issue of the financial irresponsibility and the impiety. And so as she talked about, the support she felt she got from religious leaders who, actually in some cases encouraged her to get a divorce. And one thing she said was very striking. They said I had a right to a better imam. And I think this is very interesting because here, she's using the term imam, spiritual religious leader, for her husband. And this was something I came across quite a few times, right? And it connects to this issue of the husband being positioned as both a financial and spiritual leader in the text of the KHI. And so she's not challenging that at all, but what she's asking for is for him to be a better imam. And then she talked about an incident where she reminded him to pray and he yelled at her and threw plates at her. And then she said, I can't tolerate this. I decided better not to waste my time with someone who can't change. But for those religious leaders in her telling, it was really this sort of combination of financial irresponsibility and impiety that, made them feel that the marriage was not worth keeping. And then another theme that came up quite frequently was women's ability to leave the marriage. And women felt able to leave marriages. They felt that they were able to earn money to support themselves. Certainly, they often had support from family and friends, even work colleagues sometimes. And they took pride in becoming financially independent. And certainly this was especially the case for middle-class women who, often had a tertiary education that even if they hadn't been working, they knew that they could probably get a job that paid a decent amount. But it was also true for lower-class women. I found quite a few, the lower class women I interviewed also voiced these narratives and seemed to feel confident that they could support themselves. So for example, Elok was a high school graduate. She was a former migrant worker, now working as a cleaner. She said that when she was married, and she was married quite young, her husband basically never provided any financial support. They had one child, the marriage didn't last long. She was eager to get out of it. And her process, like many lower class women, was pretty quick and easy. And she expressed no regrets about it. Mainly, she just felt relief to be free of the marriage and have custody of her child. And she commented, I prefer to live alone and earn my own income instead of having a husband who does not provide for my living. So many women, like Alok, reported a fairly smooth divorce experience. Many cases were relatively quick, particularly because husbands often did not appear in court when the wives sued for divorce. And generally when that happens, the judges can come to a decision quite quickly. Women's experiences with divorce through the courts were not always positive. And in particular, many women reported that they were not receiving the financial support to which they were entitled, the sort of small payments that they are entitled to during the waiting period. The courts do have enforcement mechanisms, but many women didn't bother to pursue them. Sometimes they weren't aware that that existed. Often they just didn't want to be bothered with it because they felt that they just wanted to be done with the marriage. It wasn't enough money to be worthwhile for them. But certainly they were, sort of disadvantaged and sometimes left with sort of a bad taste in their mouth from not getting the money that they were owed. They've certainly some faced financial disadvantages post-divorce. Being a single mother certainly is still not easy in Indonesia, and many women had to move back in with their families. Nevertheless, what I found from virtually all the women that I interviewed who had been the ones who sued for divorce is that they were fairly aware of such issues in advance, and they were not dissuaded by it. Now, another thing I think that was very interesting here is that as that interview in the middle suggests, that many women did not contest being assigned the majority of domestic responsibilities in Islamic law. This was not something that they were challenging at all, but they did express aspirations for a marriage founded on mutual love and respect and companionship. And they can certainly find support for this in that secondary vision of the KHI. Women themselves didn't tend to reference that, but the judges that I interviewed did. And I think this may be part of the reason that judges, at least from what I saw, tended to be fairly sympathetic to women suing for divorce. Several judges, in fact, told me that if a marriage lacked love and respect, if it was characterized by a lot of conflict and abuse, then it probably was not worth saving or was too broken to repair, as some of them said. So I think women are expressing higher aspirations for marriage than women in the past. And in fact, some were aware of this, talked about how their mothers or grandmothers would probably have just tried to stick it out in the marriage. But women today, I think, are much more able to act on these aspirations than previous generations would have been, because of the likelihood that they have more education and more opportunities in the workforce that give them some financial independence. So overall, then, I think, certainly something that was striking that has also been found in previous research is that many women have a fair amount of knowledge about their rights under Islam, both their rights and their obligations. This knowledge tends to come from a variety of places, from formal education, often from friends and discussions with friends, and from social media as well. But what I think is interesting here is that the Islamic legal system seems to be giving women a means to exit marriage. The emphasis on husband's obligations in the KHI certainly promotes a traditional gender division of labor, but it gives women a mechanism to hold their husbands accountable. Now, legal reformers in Indonesia have sought to make the Islamic court system more responsive to women and have been successful in certain ways. But the changes that they've advocated have generally been focused on access to justice rather than shifting the gender norms embedded in the law itself. So on the one hand, the Islamic legal system, I think, still very much reinforces conventional gender expectations, with this sort of gendered vision of marriage, right, that really hasn't changed much. But on the other hand, it potentially challenges conventional gender norms by facilitating women's exit from those marriages. So I think this is quite a fascinating paradox. And I see this as a significant unintended consequence in that the religious legal system seems to be functioning to accommodate women's aspirations for more fulfilling marriages. And women themselves, for the most part, are not frontally challenging these norms of gender and marriage, but they are certainly seizing on the opportunities presented by this legal system to exit unfulfilling or unhappy marriages. And I think in the long term, this could certainly have real implications for gender norms and practices in Indonesia, right? When you have significant numbers of women seeking more fulfilling marriages, perhaps a change in understandings and ways of thinking about marriage, perhaps women becoming more independent in their marriages, ready to leave marriages if they feel like they're not working out. These are very much real and major social changes. And so I think it's quite interesting to see the Islamic legal system facilitating them. So I think I'll stop there, and I look forward to hearing what Dia has to say and all of your questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I learned a ton from your presentation, and I'm very happy to have had the chance to learn about what you're working on and some of your findings. I'm happy now to turn it over to our discussant, Dia Irawati. Dia is a PhD candidate in anthropology at Binghamton University, State University of New York, right here in the United States. She's also a founder of Let's Talk About Sex and Sexualities. She's a social cultural anthropologist and a feminist scholar who has published several pieces on female domestic workers in Indonesia and in the transnational context. Dia, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, thank you for the IS4. Thank you, Tom, for chairing this amazing and important discussion. Thank you for inviting me to be a discussion for Rachel's presentation. Hi, Rachel, nice to see you. Virtually, obviously, right? Virtually again. Last time we met in the Zoom meeting for Let's Talk show. Well, thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation about your study. I really appreciate your research that highlights the experiences of women, or especially Muslim women, in dealing with marital life and family institution through divorce. So thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I think your research is very important in documenting women's experiences in challenging and negotiating the established social structures like marriages and families, among the subjects at the core of gender and sexuality contestation in Indonesia. So please allow me to give you an illustration about the importance of Rachel's research, especially for the feminist movement in Indonesia. So until even like 5 or 10 years ago, we still could hear public stigma and stereotypes, public discourses and public statement like quote unquote, you can be a feminist, even a very radical feminist, but you are still seen fine and good as a woman if you have a good family. So we know that family in Indonesia really matters, right? Especially this is like the legacy of the New Order regime in Suharto, how Suharto symbolized, like Indonesian as a a big family, right? Like symbolize a family. You know, like now with Rachel research, we know and understand even a lot of ordinary women, right? They can break the stigma, the silence, or in Rachel terms, is a deal breakers. For example, we can find like a divorced woman, or they can say, oh, it's okay, I'm a divorced woman and have like quote unquote broken family. But I'm free from abusive husbands, for instance, right? From polygamous marriage. So I also found a similar data or similar findings in my research. I conducted my research in West Nusa Tenggara and West Java. It's among Indonesian female transnational domestic workers. So I interviewed like 100 female domestic workers, and 47, they're divorced, right? And 10, the divorce was initiated by women. So I think like some of the my respondents or participants say that they feel happy because they are now independent and free from domestic violence. So they are now not passive permissive victims as portrayed in many popular culture or in some research or studies, as we already know about that. So they even turn the tables by saying and proving that they are good and responsible mothers. So it doesn't mean that the stigma is not there anymore and gone completely, because in Lombok, like this is like the stigma is still there, but women have the agentive capacity, you know, to initiate the divorce, I mean, to go to the court by using their own money, and they use their money to kind of like negotiation means, right, to power to change the power relations with their husbands. So we see a lot of this kind of phenomena of divorce is increasing as stated in Rachel's data, but we have a weakness. I mean, to be honest, I mean, like we have, because I'm including maybe, we have a weakness to document this kind of experiences and do the study about this issue and situation. So once again, your research, Rachel, must be highly appreciated. There is a high and increasing cases of divorce rate in Indonesia, obviously, as Rachel mentioned in her presentation. But we rarely see discussed, analyzed from the framework, from the point of view, a perspective and approach of feminist agenda of gender transformation. So I also found the data from the National Coalition for Family Development of Indonesia, as stated by Professor Sunarti, that into 2021, the divorce rate is 50 cases per hour. And the number of cerai gugat, or divorce initiated by women, as shown in Rachel's presentation, is much higher than cerai talak. And another point is marriage dissolution and divorce is very important subject that is still understudied and researched in Indonesia. So if we learn about divorce practices, there is a multiplicity variation of the practices. And the variations indicate the complexities, the dynamics of divorce in real life, including the context of gender, sexuality, class, religion, ethnicity, geographical location, ages, abilities, disabilities, and so on and so forth. For example, this is what I found in my research sites and also in my hometown in Medan, North Sumatra. At least there are three ways or forms of divorce in terms of the practices of, and each of them has different implications, especially for women and children. So first, by filing a divorce claim before the court, religious Islamic court for Muslims. So this is called registered divorce, right, through court. This is applied for gugat cerai and gugat talak. And the second one is unregistered divorce through gugat talak by saying talak, like I talak you. And this is a privilege and rights for men, or it's called unilateral rights to divorce. And this is religiously validated, right? I mean, like, especially if we just use the old interpretation or the patriarchal interpretation of Islam. So we would say that, you know, Islam only allows men to gugat, right, talak. So the third one is just separation without divorce process. This is a lot. This is quite a lot. I mean, like in real life, no talak, no divorce, just live separately by themselves, just cut off the relationship completely. And this practice outside the court, I think, needs to be discussed separately because it reflects a lot of problems and issues in Indonesia, including access to the court. Some of the women, and a lot, I think, like some people in the, not in the big city, even in Medan in big city, it's still a lot, right? Like even like in my extended family still experience that. And they don't know how to deal with the court. No money, and it's time and energy consuming. They're scared or afraid of dealing with the court, scared of the stigma, scared of the consequences, etc., etc. Well, unlike the women being Rachel participants showing power and agency in these divorce practices, they experience manifold forms of violence and violation of their rights. So from this story, we still can find a lot of cases of divorce that are still not liberating and empowering women, where they lack legal protection, and divorce make them much poorer, right? Because there is no protection, no legal protection of their rights, no economic and social support. I mean, like it's different from the Tia, Nur, and Ella, because Rachel participant, they have like social support, like from friends, from family, but like many women, they do not have social support and emotional and economic support. My comment will highlight more framework from feminist activism. I know your approach is more sociological, Rachel, so I will add like more on the feminist activism lenses, even though I'm also coming from the anthropological background. So first point is, from the feminist perspective, the experiences of these women are really powerful feminist experience, or empowered mothers or empowered women from the discourse, if we see from the discourses of mothering and motherhood. So it shows agency as a woman, and most importantly, and more powerfully, because what they are challenged, right? What they challenge is among the most established and powerful structures, Islam and the family, let alone the state, right? We haven't talked about the state that plays the most important role in the institution of Islam and the family. But my question, this is from the perspective of feminist activism, how and why does that agentive capacity of women to negotiate emerge and evolve? How do these women develop their agency? Where is the position of feminist activism in Indonesia in development of agentive capacity among these ordinary women? Do these women build the feminist political consciousness separate from feminist movement? How do they learn about freedom, authority, autonomy, empowerment, independence, resistance, subversion, and women's subjectivity? Rachel mentioned the interrelated changes such as like education, right, economic independence, and women know information from social media, education, peers, right? But you know, like a lot of women use social media and they have friends, right? They have like good education, higher education. But still, I mean, like some of them do not have, you know, kind of like the empowerment or the political consciousness. So what's going on? How are we gonna respond to this, right? I think this is the thing that we need to look at. It is crucial and important to look at Islamic law and Islamic court to see how the reform of the Islamic family law enables, right, these women to initiate or apply divorce, and the connection between the agenda of Islamic reform to the practice of divorce that signifies the transformation of gender equality. From Rachel's research, we know that the reform plays a key role in driving the women to do the petition and register their divorce before the law, going to the court. For example, is the making of KHI, I will call it KHI, it's a compilation of Islamic law in 1991. But my question is, from 1991 to 2000-ish, if the legal reform is the only key factor, why during that period of time, there were no high cases of divorce initiated by women? Even they are not popular cases in Indonesia. I think we need to look at, you know, the broader context outside the legal reform and process in the court itself. Some important keys here during the period of post-reformasi that shows the increasing number of divorces initiated by women. I think there are some key points that I would like to highlight and bring up here. First, in 2004, we successfully issued an act of the elimination of domestic violence, and then at the same time, Kelompok Kerja Gender or Gender Working Group at the Ministry of Religious Affairs under Professor Musda Mulia initiated the counter-legal draft of KHI, compilation of Islamic law, in the same year, right? We have like Undang-Undang Elimination of Domestic Violence, or PKDRT, and also the counter-legal draft of KHI. This is an attempt to provide an alternative and more progressive interpretation of KHI. Just one example, nusyuz means disobedient in marriage relationship. In the old KHI, only applies to women. But if we see in the counter-legal draft, they propose an alternative interpretation that nusyuz can be applied both to wife and husband. So the consequences of it, if the woman think that her husband committed disobedience, she can gugat cerai. women can initiate divorce, right? This is progressive. And we also found a very important feminist initiative called PAKA, Female-Headed Household, initiated in 2000 by Nani Zulminani. This is also important to bring up, and which one of its programs is indeed access to justice that educates women in dealing with the family court. So, and also to educate women to be empowered, like empowered, self-worth, and also like self-transformation. And they try to reverse the stigma. They try to eliminate the stigma of widow because, well, the stigma is still there in Indonesia, right? And they, as a government, mentioned as a spoiled identity, a tainted identity, but they said that, well, we have our own identity as a mother, as a divorced woman. So another thing is, another issue is, I think that's the broader social context in terms of the divorce and family in Indonesia during the 2020 is, during the post-reformasi, the Undang-Undang PKDRT, the counter-legal draft, and PAKA, this is like the most important contribution of feminist activism in post-reformasi. That's what I mentioned before. To reform the law, not only the law, but the culture of the law, right? And the significance in bringing up this key point is to see and make sense of the development of post-reformasi, to fashion a social circumstance, right? To seek a social circumstance and public awareness to be critical against the laws, to speak up, to fight for their rights related to family rights. So in many cases, the feminists didn't teach them and tell them how to resist and fight for their rights because feminists cannot reach out all of the women across the country. On the other hand, we also witnessed the growing spirit of reform and transformation among the legal apparatus. At the same time, we also have more Muslim ulama or clerics, women and men alike, are progressive and become a source of reference for women seeking Islamic legitimacy or justification, such as the quote taken from Noor as the title of recent presentation today. Several religious leaders supported me to getting divorced. They said, I have a right to be a better imam. This is the broader social and political transformation that I mentioned that involve feminist activism. But I think if Noor comes to more progressive and feminist religious leaders and figures who are available now, you can name some of the names, and we have Kupi now, right? She make it another suggestion like, you have the right, for instance, quote unquote, you have the right to be a better imam, or you are the one who can be the imam. So because she is the head or the leader of the household or family, right? And she deserves to be imam. Another point is, this is another situation that complicate and problematize that reveal the complexity of the relationship between economic and financial independence and divorce initiated by women. If we look at women from middle and upper class, they have secure economic, in terms of economic capacity, but some choose to remain in their marriage, right? So they experience domestic violence, they have like abusive husband, they live in the polygamous marriage. So this is something that we need to look at. So education, to be independent economically, that's not enough. So we need to have like a broader political and social nuances or context. So while we see a lot of transformation and changes in marriage and family practices that indicate new family, new motherhood, new gender reconstruction, but the initiative to make the existing law more relevant to those changes are rare. As we are aware, Indonesian marriage law made in 1974, and we still use it until currently, right? Until right now, more than 30 years. And family is based on the sexual or gender division of labor, right? It's still like the separation dichotomy between public and private. So women are the housewife, homemaker, caretaker, the secondary breadwinner, and the husbands are the imam, right? The breadwinner or main breadwinner, and they're not responsible for the taking care of the children. We need to reform because this is not relevant, the obsolete, with the actual and social reality that changes a lot, like over time, and it's different place to places. So it is our priority to reform or revise or amend the existing marriage or family law that consider new gender practices, new motherhood, and also new family. Last but not least, if we don't put the legal reform as our priority, we are worried this progressive and transformative direction will be taken over by the so-called supporters and advocates of conservative turn, We see the tendency toward the conservatism to the idea of family resilience bill, RUU Ketahanan Keluarga, and in some local government issue some local regulation or Perda on family controlling women and women responsible for for moral development. And this is still patriarchal sexual division of labor. There are a lot of things to do, both academic work and political activism, to make sure that the so-called female agency in the context of divorce will recognize, confirm, and articulate it. Thanks again for having me in this important discussion. I hope there will be more research, study, and feminist activism paying attention to the issue of family, including divorce. Still lots of homework, of course. I think progressive demeanor, positive gesture, and vibes like the legal reform is supposed to be hand in hand with the reform and transformation of the culture to create a supportive environment for women's rights enforcement and women's empowerment that allow and enables women to have opportunity and alternative in their life, as well as the reform of transformation in the whole system, the legal apparatus, and law enforcer, and to take into account women's aspiration about happy marriage and notion of companionship and equality. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dia, for those wonderful comments. We are really grateful for your close and careful engagement with Rachel's presentation today. Rachel, I'm looking at the time, and we will need to wrap up at 10 p.m. Indonesian time sharp. So what I'm going to do is open it up to questions from the audience. There's a couple questions in the queue. If you would like to ask a question yourself, I'm going to invite you to type that into the Q&A box that you should see there. And then I will read the questions out to Rachel, and Rachel will try to give you at least a little bit of time to respond to these questions and also to Dia's really useful comments. So I'm going to start with a question from Jessica Sudirgo. Jessica writes, I was wondering if you could speculate on how your findings travel to Indonesia more broadly. To what extent is the more progressive response of the Islamic courts to divorce in Malang and Jogja influenced by the predominant forms of Islam in those areas, which tend to be characterized, rightly or wrongly, as more moderate? Air quotes.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And a part of the answer to that is something that surprised me, actually. When I interviewed the judges, I found out that they are circulated around the country. So they actually, and this is a very deliberate policy, that they don't stay in any one place for more than like 2 to 3 years. And so they constantly move around, which actually, is something kind of a hardship in some ways to have to do that and, move your whole family. But so many of them, when they listed their various postings, and they had really kind of circulated around the country. And I believe that this is done partly to, I think the main intention was to prevent corruption, essentially, and prevent them from, forming too many ties with people in a particular area that they felt bound to. But I think it also has the effect to some degree of meaning that the judges themselves are not necessarily all that influenced by the predominant forms of Islam in the place where they're practicing. So the judges that I interviewed in both Malang and Jogja, some of them were from the area, but a lot of them were not. Now, I didn't do that many interviews with judges, so I can't say sort of more broadly, how likely is it that a particular judge will be from the region where they're practicing law? But so I think it felt to me anyway that the courts are somewhat designed to be independent of their region. Now, certainly, I think perhaps there are still sort of cultural influences from the region, no doubt, that are sort of inescapable. But, and I imagine if you went to courts in some of the more conservative areas, you might find some slightly different tendencies. But it seemed like overall, a lot of judges are being trained at sort of some of the same schools in Jakarta and elsewhere, and there's sort of this kind of national judge pool that circulates around the country.
Thank you, Rachel. The next question here is from Farid Mutakin. Fareed asks, in Rachel's study, in some cases, women initiated divorce because they experienced domestic violence from their husbands. Did they report to police the domestic violence in addition to processing the divorce? If not, why? Why, in the legal consciousness among these women, did it not happen in the case of domestic violence, but only in the context of divorce?
Yeah, that's a great question. I did not ask about police, so, I don't know for sure, but it never came up in an interview. So that makes me think that very few women actually reported domestic violence to police, but they were aware of the law against it, as were judges. And so I think both parties very much shared the view that, this is often a key reason for divorce. The judges didn't rule out people staying in a marriage where that had happened. They saw it as like an understandable reason for divorce, but not sort of an automatic reason for divorce. But it felt, there was certainly, I think, an emerging consciousness among women that this is not something that you should put up with. So yeah, I suspect that the reasons that they don't report to police are probably the same kinds of reasons you find in, many other societies, right? That reporting to police often doesn't go all that well for women, that it can bring in a lot of complexities, that are sort of unwanted, and that, that sometimes perhaps the sort of criminal justice system is not where, women want this case to end up, right? It's just more of sort of a sense that they want to be away from their husband. They don't want him to be put in jail necessarily.
Thank you, Rachel. I have a question for myself that draws on kind of my own thoughts about the sort of comparative incidence of divorce and the factors that characterize it. And I'm curious if you were able, I understand why this would be hard, if you were able to interview women who were still in marriages, who had been perhaps considering divorce, or for which there is some reason to believe that a divorce is something that they would like to pursue, but they haven't so far. I'm interested in this question because I wonder how much of these dynamics are specific to those who are successful in achieving or filing for divorce, or those are sort of general issues that that emerge even without that as an institutional response.
Yeah, most of the women I interviewed had already gone through the process of divorce, but some of them were still in the process. So I didn't interview anybody who was just sort of thinking about it, but hadn't done anything yet. So I think, I feel like that would be really hard a hard population to recruit for interviews. But certainly, one of the things that came out of some interviews was there were definitely some women who had waited a long time for divorce, for all sorts of reasons. Particularly, some of them wanted their husband to be the one that sued for divorce. They wanted him to, because that way he would bear the financial burden and they would be entitled to more restitution. And so sometimes that took a little bit of doing and a lot of strategizing over a few years to get that to happen. So, that was one reason that sometimes, women said that they had wanted a divorce a long time ago, but it took a long time to happen. Other times, some women said that they were saving up money for themselves to be able to live on afterwards. So, yeah, I think, generally speaking, the dynamics I'm talking about are fairly specific to women who who have successfully achieved divorce, and almost all women's divorce suits are approved by the judges. I never even ran across anybody who was not able to get a divorce who had wanted one. Sometimes it took longer than they expected. So, I think these women, though, because divorce has become a relatively common experience, right? I think these women do give us a window in to see what's happening in, heterosexual marriages in Indonesia, right? And I think these women are sort of the leading edge of changes that are happening, these broader changes that I think are occurring with regard to women's aspirations for what a marriage should be. And to connect a little bit to what Dia was asking about in terms of, where is this agency coming from, right? And of course, as somebody that spent a lot of time studying feminist activists, I was intrigued by that as well. And I didn't see a lot of what I would say is an actual feminist consciousness among the women I interviewed, right? Most of them did not challenge the idea that women are primarily responsible for domestic responsibilities, that, it's better for the husbands to be the breadwinner, right? They very much adhered to those views, but they had this view of even within that structure, a marriage can be based on love and mutuality. And so I think it's much more of this sort of general shift, right, to an understanding of marriage that's based around those ideas about companionship and love, that are sort of being brought to the fore. I think feminist activism has played a role. I mean, certainly women know about domestic violence, right? There's consciousness of that. There's a sense that that's a bad thing that you shouldn't have to put up with. So, I think some of that activism has kind of filtered into the public consciousness in interesting ways that I think are working to reshape conceptions of marriage and intimate relationships.
We have time, I think, for one more question from the Zoom. And so this comes from Sukendar. Do women and children get financial support mandated from the court after divorce from their ex-husbands? And secondarily, if husbands former husbands do not fulfill their obligations, what is generally the response of the women? What do the women do?
So a lot of the women I interviewed, whether they sued for divorce or whether their husband was the one who sued for divorce, did not get the financial support that they were entitled to. That was very common. That was kind of the number one complaint about the process. The courts do have enforcement mechanisms, but very few of the women I talked to pursued that at all. And when I asked them why, they generally said that they just didn't want to be bothered. For some of them, it meant sort of, they felt like it would kind of force them to be in touch with their ex-spouse, and they didn't even want to talk to him or be involved at all. And even though the judges told me that there are ways to enforce that don't require the partners to be in touch with each other, it seemed like the women just felt like they just didn't want to bother with that. But they did sometimes feel somewhat bitter that they didn't get the money that they were entitled to. So yeah, I mean, they got jobs, they turned to family for support. And it seemed like most of them, even those, from poorer backgrounds, were able to do fairly well for themselves, often with support of family.
I want to thank you, Rachel and Dia, for this wonderful discussion that we've had today. I certainly learned a lot about things that I've long been curious about, but haven't had any expertise in. And I think that in addition to providing, I think, a really important academic service, it's gotten me thinking a lot about the ways that we as scholars of Indonesian politics and society can engage with, pressing issues of our time. So please, those of you who are in the audience, you will not be able to be heard, but I will clap on your behalf. Thank you very much to you both. And thanks to all of you for joining in today. We look forward to seeing you at our next presentation. Until then, stay well and stay safe.